All right. So I wanted to just ramble a little bit real quick about the mindset of creatively problem solving, no code problems. And that's going to be the most important thing is to just switch the mindset when you're starting to build these things that are more complex. Some examples that you maybe haven't seen online yet. This is kind of the way that I approach things and the way that I think. So the first thing, and I had to just write down these thoughts so I can get all this out, and then I'm going to show you like an example or two of like how I had thought differently, I guess. But the first thing is to think in systems, not just tools. And what I mean by that is like every workflow is part of a larger system. And so you ask yourself, what role does this automation play in the overall business process? So don't get stuck only thinking that you need to do things with an end to end because you have all these other tools available to you that you can leverage. And what I mean by that is sometimes you can't just keep the data flow in end to end. Sometimes it makes so much more sense just because of the way you have your data coming through, whether it's one item with all these different fields, or whether you want to get that into multiple items, or you want to have sub items in your objects, or whatever it is. Sometimes it's just easier to throw everything that you have somewhere externally and just pull it back in, just because you have more control. So if you had watched my deep research video, what I was doing here is, I was basically getting research, and I was just kind of going through the process of I would research chapter 1 and then I'd store everything in a Google Sheet. And I'd research chapter 2 and I'd store everything in a Google Sheet. That way I didn't have to worry about where my variables were and where I was having things to pull back in later. All I had to do was research all 5 chapters, and then at the end I could just pull everything back in because I know where it's stored and I have a system for how I'm storing that kind of stuff. Um, so that's one example. I'm also doing a very similar thing with this is just something I'm working on right now where creating some shorts, and there's a lot of images. There's going to be like 24 images at the end. And I just didn't want to worry about these different items, having to pass them through the different APIs and like try to keep track of them and maybe potentially loop through, or do I aggregate it and I split out? So I just decided, okay, I'm just going to store the images um, somewhere else. And actually, this isn't even the most updated version. This is the first version that I did. And then I was like, okay, I don't want to store the image prompts in the sheet. I want to store the actual what's it called? I want to store the actual image links in there. So then I can just grab them in even easier later. So if I click into right here, you'll see this one's a little different where I'm actually just storing the image URLs in the sheet, and that's the way I ended up liking it. And so that's another point where, I'm probably going to jump around here, but another point I had here was fail fast and debug often. Because even though you've got your process map and your wireframe, you don't know what you don't know. And the quicker that you fail and get in trouble with a workflow, the quicker that you can just iterate and change it up. And so, yeah, obviously I spent some time in that first workflow, and I just said, okay, I'm just going to copy and paste this one into a new one. I don't have to worry about if I break it or not because I've got my backup. And now I'm just going to change some things and test it out and see which one is more intuitive and which one's actually easier to work with. And your first automation, when it's finished, that's never going to be the one that you're actually using because of the whole QA phase and the edge cases and the testing and the prompting. And a lot of times you'll even be like, wait a minute, I have these 2 nodes here when this could just be one node. Or this node isn't actually doing anything valuable at all. Let me just get rid of that. And you're going to be changing stuff around. Um, so yeah, fail fast and debug often. So I also want to talk about a big mindset thing, which is chunking everything into micro actions. Because it's really easy to get overwhelmed when you're thinking about, okay, right now I'm at A and I have to get to Z, and there's just so many steps in between, and it's so overwhelming, and I don't know where to begin. And that's why breaking it down step by step is kind of what we're talking about here. But that's also the mindset you should have when you're in and building this kind of stuff, because you still may get overwhelmed. Because let's say you process map out some stuff and you realize, okay, that in this one step that I had mapped out, there's actually going to be like 6 or 7 nodes in this one step because I didn't granularly enough break down this process. And so when you're in end-to-end, you see like the overall goal. You have one module in your wireframe, but this one module is actually going to be a couple nodes. So every single thing that you're trying to do can be chunked down into a micro action. And that's how you can just go from A to B, from B to C, and C to B, A, B, C, D, E, from C to D. I almost just forgot the alphabet. But that way you're making everything actually swallowable. And it's just like, okay, I have this set of data right here. The next step, if I was to do this process manually and I was looking at these 5 pieces of data, what would I do next? Even if that's the smallest thing, what would I do next? And then just say, okay, what node actually correlates to me doing that? And just take it one small step at a time. This really ties into the next one, which is about thinking in inputs and outputs. So always ask what's the input and what's the desired output, right? That's how you can take it step by step. Automate what you already do manually. I think that goes hand in hand. Don't be afraid to store and enrich data. So this is kind of what I was talking about, right, with the earlier thing about keeping things in other places and even doing some processing on the third-party system, and then you pull it back into n8n. So one thing real quick before we look at these other ones, I had alluded to like being able to do human in the loop without this stuff, right? So what I mean by that is, let's say we have this email, okay? And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to store that in a Google Sheet. So we're going to do create append row and sheet. I'm going to grab this one that I just created for this demo, human loop demo. It is called sheet 1, and there's like 3 fields right here. Okay, so we have email, status, and feedback, right? So email, status, feedback. I'm going to plug in the email. The status is going to be like pending feedback, and then the feedback is going to be blank, right? So we're going to send that off. So then what we have here is this automation runs and it creates an email, and then it's stored here for us. And what also you'd probably want to do is maybe like you're going to store it, but then also like send a Slack notification and say, hey, here's the link to the Google Sheet. Please go approve this message, right? And so then the human would come in here, and actually it would be more intuitive if this was a drop down where we had pending feedback and then we had like, okay, I don't know, like whatever you want to call it. So we'd have pending feedback and then we'd have something else. So the human would come in here. This looks great. The human would come in here, and then the human would change this to okay. And then we could have another automation that triggers based on this. So, what you could do is you could come in here and have a different workflow that has a Google Sheets trigger. And it basically goes off when something gets changed in... Let me just sign in real quick. So the idea is that it would go off when something changes, right? So now that we're back in, give me a sec. When the human goes in there and actually gives feedback and then changes that thing to update, we could just basically pull that in, right? So it would fire off this workflow. Now that the status is okay, we could also just do like a quick filter if status equals okay, and we'd only keep the first row or whatever it is. But I think you get the idea, is like, that's how you can bake in human in the loop, but keep it automated, because the human then just has to come in here and flick a switch, and then it's going to trigger the rest of the workflow. So that's like a way to think about, if this functionality isn't natively in n8n, if I was n8n and I was trying to build this functionality natively in, what would I do? And how could I allow this process to be automated? And then you just kind of reverse engineer it. Okay. Start ugly, then improve. This kind of goes along with fail fast and debug often. Just the quicker you can get to a POC or an MVP, whether that's for you and your team or whether that's for a client, the quicker you get that feedback and start to iterate, because that iterative process is that's the most valuable part. That QA is the most valuable part, the quality assurance, and understanding their user journey as far as like, okay, I don't know what's going on in the back end with this automation. As a manager of a sales team, this is what I want to do from this automation. I want to have this touch point right here, and then I want to get this. And then I'm going to give feedback to the person developing this situation or the solution, and they can take that feedback and they can understand what's going on in the back end and tweak what they need to tweak in order to match what I'm looking for. And the quicker you can get that POC and the quicker you can get feedback from someone to align on what they're actually looking for as their journey with this automation and their relationship with this automation, the better. Another one is like, obviously use the community, because chances are if you're running into an issue, so many other people have had that exact same issue, whether that's in AIS Plus or whether that's just on the n8n forums or YouTube or just ChatGPT. ChatGPT, while it may not be the best at being trained on like n8n stuff and nodes and logic, it's going to be really helpful. When I was learning, I would just like bounce ideas off of it, and it was a really good thought partner. because sometimes all you need is someone to play devil's advocate or someone to just approach it from a different perspective. And that's how you can sort of like the light bulb moment. So I talk to ChatGPT all the time, but also, it's just one of those things, right? Like, you may think it's a dumb question, but if you've thought it, thousands of other people have also thought it, probably more than thousands. So look stuff up, absolutely. But before you look stuff up, try to think about first, what is this error message telling me? And is there anything I can try before I go look on a forum? Because if your first resort is to go look at a forum or something, you're just not getting in the right mindset of like, let me try to solve this myself. And I think I've alluded to this before, but it's like, once you've built a couple workflows and you've had multiple errors happen, you'll realize that there's only like, not only, but like errors kind of fit into like 5 main buckets or something. And so the more you expose yourself and you get the repetitions of solving and seeing these errors, seeing and solving these errors, the better. Because at this point, like, as soon as I see an error message, I almost know exactly what has went wrong. And I can almost like know exactly where to go and look to find that error. And the other thing that's tricky is sometimes an error will happen, but it doesn't actually go red, meaning the automation doesn't work the way you expected. And that's usually due to something with AI, but everything went green. So like on paper, everything worked, but that's not what you wanted it to do. And those are a little bit more tricky to pinpoint where and why, but that's why it's important to understand how to read the execution data and the agent logs and stuff like that. And then know when not to automate. This is probably going to be clear when you're doing your process mapping. But there are definitely times where it's like, if I was to build this automation, is that just actually way more expensive, or is it actually way more error prone, or is it actually just way more time consuming than if I just did this myself, or if my team just did this myself? Because also, is the struggle of even first of all learning how to automate this process, is that not worth it? And not that that's always the case, right? I believe that most things can be automated, at least 80-90%, where the human has touch point at the end. But something to think about at least. Not forcing anything, right? So anyways, those were my quick thoughts here, and I hope that helped. Some of those little mindset things as far as, like thinking like a no-code automator that aren't as intuitive, because based on everyone's background, you kind of think differently, and background both like society and also like educationally and professionally. Like software engineers, the reason why they can sometimes pick up this kind of stuff really quick, not only because they understand like variables and JavaScript, but they have been brought up and educated in a way that's a very, very step-by-step, logical, creatively problem-solving mindset of putting pieces together to make sense. And when you can really build these systems where they're robust, they actually keep the data in control the whole time. You can only do that step by step, but then you can realize that like I have the power and I have the understanding of how to keep the automation exactly down this one path that I want it to go down. So anyways, thanks for listening to the ramble here, and that's it for this one.